The rain fell against the windows of Ravenscroft Manor like whispered secrets, each drop carrying the weight of words unspoken, as Eleanor Sinclair stood trembling in the candlelit bedchamber on the night of October 14th, 1814, her wedding night, though she could scarcely believe herself worthy of such a title as wife to the Earl of Ravenscroft. And her hands shook so violently that she pressed them flat against the cool silk of her white nightgown to still their betrayal of her terror. Frederick stood by the fire, his back to her, the flames casting long shadows across his broad shoulders, while the gold of his signet ring caught the light as he lifted a glass of brandy to his lips, and Eleanor knew she had perhaps 5 minutes of courage remaining before it abandoned her entirely, leaving her to live the rest of her days in a marriage built upon deception. She had rehearsed these words 1,000 times in the weeks since he had proposed, turning them over in her mind like stones worn smooth by constant handling, yet now they lodged in her throat like fragments of broken glass, each one threatening to tear her apart from the inside. The fire crackled and the rain intensified, and still she could not speak, could not force herself to shatter the careful peace of this moment with the ugly truth of what she was, of what had been done to her 5 years ago in a moonlit garden while a masquerade ball played on inside, oblivious to her destruction. "Frederick," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, and he turned to face her with those penetrating grey eyes that had always seemed to see straight through to her soul, and she wondered if he could see her shame now, see it written across her skin like a brand. "There is something I must tell you," she continued, forcing each word past the tightness in her chest. "Something I should have confessed before you offered for me, before you bound yourself to a woman who does not deserve the honor of your name." He set down his glass and moved toward her with that deliberate grace she had come to know so well during their courtship, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight, and Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes as she prepared to watch that tender regard transform into disgust and betrayal. "I am not," she began, then stopped, drawing a ragged breath before pushing forward into the abyss of her confession. "I am not a virgin, Frederick. I am not the innocent bride you believe you married, and if you wish to annul this union, I will understand. I will not fight you. I will simply disappear, and you need never see me again." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity, broken only by the relentless rain and the hammering of her own heart. And Eleanor closed her eyes against the rejection she knew was coming, against the moment when this beautiful dream would crumble into the ashes of her ruined past. But then Frederick was before her, his warm hands cupping her face with impossible tenderness. And when she dared to open her eyes, she found not anger or revulsion, but something that looked remarkably like love. And his voice when he spoke was low and gentle, and absolutely certain as he whispered, "I know, Eleanor, I know. I was there." 5 years earlier, on the evening of September 21st, 1809, the grand ballroom of Lord Harcourt's estate blazed with the light of 1,000 candles as Eleanor Ashworth stepped through the gilded doors and felt her breath catch in her throat at the magnificent spectacle before her, for this was her first major ball, and everything seemed touched with magic, from the crystal chandeliers refracting rainbow prisms across the marble floors to the swirling couples in their elaborate costumes and mysterious masks that transformed ordinary lords and ladies into creatures of fantasy and intrigue. She was 21 years old, and still foolish enough to believe that tonight might change everything, that somewhere among these glittering strangers she might find someone who would see past her plain features and modest dowry to the heart that beat so hopefully beneath her pale blue gown, and she touched the silver mask that concealed the upper half of her face, as though it were a talisman that might grant her wishes. The warm late summer air drifted through the open terrace doors, carrying the scent of roses from the famous Harcourt Gardens, and Eleanor felt herself swaying slightly to the orchestra's waltz as she watched her younger sister Clara being swept onto the dance floor by yet another admiring gentleman, Clara with her golden curls and rosebud lips, who never lacked for partners while Eleanor stood among the matrons and wallflowers, invisible as always. Her mother, Lady Harriet, stood nearby, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd for eligible prospects, and Eleanor knew that look well, knew that her mother had long since given up on making a brilliant match for her middle daughter, and focused all her ambitious hopes on beautiful Clara instead. From across the vast ballroom, concealed in the shadows near a marble column, a man in a black domino mask watched the girl in silver and pale blue with an intensity that surprised even himself. For Frederick Sinclair had attended this masquerade only at his father's insistence and had expected nothing but tedium and empty social pleasantries. Yet something about the way this young woman stood apart from the crowd, something about the wistful hope in her posture and the gentle way she smiled at the dancing couples, as though wishing them well, even in her loneliness, had captured his attention completely. He was 27 and had seen enough of society's beauties to be ennuied by mimar prettiness. But there was something different here, something genuine and unguarded that called to him across the candle-lit expanse. He watched as a man in a gold mask approached her, saw her startled pleasure at being noticed, and Frederick felt his jaw tighten as he recognized Lord Marcus Crawford behind. That gleaming disguise, Crawford, whose reputation with innocent young women was whispered about in gentlemen's clubs but never spoken of in polite company. Crawford, who was even now bowing over the silver-masked girl's hand with practiced charm while she blushed and smiled, utterly unaware of the predator who had just selected her as his prey for the evening. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Crawford was everything Eleanor had been taught to admire in a gentleman, his gold mask gleaming in the candlelight as he led her through the intricate steps of a country dance, his gloved hand warm and confident at her waist, his voice a melodious instrument playing notes of flattery that she had never heard directed at herself before, and she found herself laughing at his witticisms and blushing at his compliments, while some distant part of her mind marveled that such a handsome and sophisticated man would choose to spend his evening with plain Eleanor Ashworth when beautiful Clara was dancing not 20 feet away. He brought her champagne, glass after glass of the golden bubbling liquid that made her head feel pleasantly light and her worries seem very far away. And when her mother caught sight of them together, Lady Harriet's face transformed with an avarice that Eleanor had only ever seen directed at Clara's suitors before, a silent approval that seemed to grant permission for whatever was unfolding between them. From his position near the column, Frederick watched the scene with mounting dread, for he had heard the whispers about Crawford in the smoking rooms and card parlors, whispered accounts of young women ruined and silenced, of families paid off and reputations destroyed, and he could see the familiar pattern unfolding before him like a play he had witnessed too many times before. The isolation from chaperones, the constant flow of champagne, the gradual movement away from the crowded ballroom toward the darker edges of the gathering. He tried once to intervene, approaching the pair during a pause in the music and requesting an introduction to the young lady. But Crawford's eyes behind the gold mask had flashed with territorial warning, and Eleanor, flustered and confused by the attention of two gentlemen at once, had stammered something polite but dismissive before Crawford smoothly guided her away toward the refreshment table and another glass of champagne. The terrace doors stood open to the warm September night, and Frederick watched as Crawford leaned close to whisper something in Eleanor's ear, watched as she glanced toward those doors with uncertainty that Crawford quickly overwhelmed with more charm and gentle pressure, his hand at the small of her back, guiding her inexorably toward the darkness beyond. Frederick began to move through the crowd, but a dowager he vaguely recognized seized his arm with questions about his father's health and his family's estates, and by the time he extricated himself from her grasp, the girl in the silver mask and the predator in gold had vanished through the terrace doors into the garden beyond. The night air carried the heavy perfume of roses as Frederick strode onto the terrace, his eyes scanning the shadowed pathways and ornamental hedgerows for any sign of the pale blue gown, and he heard laughter drifting from various corners of the garden where other couples had sought privacy. but something cold and certain in his chest told him that wherever Crawford had taken the girl, there would be no laughter, and he began to run toward the darkest corner of the garden, where the hedgerows grew thick enough to muffle any sound. The garden path wound deeper into darkness, as Crawford's grip on Eleanor's arm tightened from guiding to restraining, and she felt the first flutter of genuine fear pierce through the champagne haze, when she realized they had walked far beyond the lantern light into a secluded corner where the hedgerows grew tall and thick enough to swallow any sound, and she tried to laugh and suggest they return to the ballroom, but her voice came out thin and uncertain as Crawford turned to face her with an expression that bore no resemblance to the charming gentleman who had danced with her mere minutes before. His gold mask caught the faint moonlight as he pushed her backward against a stone garden bench, and Eleanor's mind struggled to comprehend the sudden transformation, the way his elegant hands became brutal instruments as they tore at the delicate fabric of her pale blue gown, while she gasped out protests that he silenced with a hand clamped over her mouth, his weight pressing her down onto the cold stone as she fought against him with all her strength. Her silver mask knocked askew so that she could barely see, her muffled cries swallowed by the thick hedge walls that surrounded them like the walls of a prison. She kicked and twisted and clawed at his face, managing to knock his gold mask away so that she could see his true features contorted with ugly determination, and she bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth, tasting blood, hearing him curse as he struck her across the face with enough force to make stars explode behind her eyes. And she knew with terrible certainty that no one would hear her, that no one would come, that she would be ruined here in this dark garden by a man whose name she barely knew while the music played on inside, and her mother congratulated herself on Eleanor finally attracting attention. But somewhere in the garden, Frederick Sinclair was running, his black domino mask still in place as he followed instinct and dread toward the darkest corner of the estate. And he heard it then, a muffled cry that sent ice through his veins, and he crashed through the hedge with no thought for stealth or propriety, finding the scene that confirmed his worst fears, the girl in the torn blue gown pinned beneath Crawford, whose face twisted with rage at the interruption. Frederick seized Crawford by the collar and hurled him away from Eleanor with a strength born of pure fury, and Crawford stumbled back, his lip bloodied where Eleanor had bitten him, his eyes wild as he recognized the black domino mask of the man who had tried to intervene earlier, and for a moment the two men faced each other in the moonlight, while Eleanor curled into herself on the garden bench, her gown hanging in ruins, her wrists already darkening with bruises, her breath coming in ragged sobs as she tried to understand what had happened and what had been prevented, knowing only that a stranger in black had appeared like a figure from a nightmare or a dream, and that Crawford was backing away with murder in his eyes, and that nothing would ever be the same again after this night in the garden where the roses still bloomed sweetly overhead, indifferent to the violence their perfume had witnessed. Crawford fled into the darkness like the coward he was, disappearing through a gap in the hedgerow after Frederick spoke a single sentence in a voice so cold and quiet that it carried more menace than any shouted threat, a promise of utter destruction should he ever speak of this night or approach this woman again. And then Frederick turned his attention to the girl who sat trembling on the garden bench, her torn gown clutched to her chest, her silver mask lost somewhere in the struggle, her face a pale oval of shock and shame in the moonlight, as tears streamed silently down her cheeks, while her body shook with the aftermath of terror. He approached her slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal, and he removed his black domino mask so that she might see his face, though her eyes were too blurred with tears and trauma to truly register his features in the darkness. And he knelt before her on the damp grass, with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man who had just hurled another across the garden with such violence. He drew a handkerchief from his coat pocket, fine white linen monogrammed with the initials F.S. in elegant script that she would not notice until much later when she examined it by candlelight in her bedroom, and he pressed it into her shaking hands while speaking in a deep voice that cut through her panic like a warm blade through ice, telling her that she was safe now, that the man was gone, that none of this was her fault and she must never believe otherwise. The scent of sandalwood drifted from him as he carefully helped her to her feet, keeping his eyes averted from her torn bodice while he removed his own evening coat and draped it around her shoulders, and she clutched the too large garment around herself as he asked if she could walk, if she could manage to return to the house through a servant's entrance he knew of, and she nodded mutely, because her voice had abandoned her entirely, lost somewhere in that dark corner of the garden, along with her innocence and her hope. He guided her through the shadows with a hand that barely touched her elbow, respectful of her shattered dignity, and he found the servant's door exactly where he had said it would be, and he told her in that same deep voice that she should go directly to her family and claim a headache, that no one need ever know what had occurred unless she chose to tell them. And when she finally looked up at him with desperate gratitude shining through her tears, she saw only a tall silhouette against the moonlit garden, a stranger whose face she could not quite resolve into memory, no matter how hard she tried. He asked her name, and she tried to answer, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, and before she could repeat herself more clearly, voices approached from somewhere in the garden, and he stepped back into the shadows, urging her to go now while she could, and she stumbled through the servant's entrance without ever telling him who she was, without ever learning his name, carrying only his handkerchief and his coat that she would have to hide, and the memory of a deep voice promising her that this was not her fault, words she would cling to like a lifeline across all the dark years to come. The pale grey light of dawn had barely touched the windows of the Ashworth townhouse when Eleanor crept from her bed on legs that trembled beneath her body aching in places she could not bear to examine too closely, and she moved like a ghost through the silent corridors to retrieve the bundle she had hidden beneath her mattress before collapsing into fitful sleep, the torn remnants of her pale blue gown wrapped around the stranger's evening coat, and the white handkerchief she had clutched through the endless hours of darkness. And she knew she must dispose of the evidence before the household stirred and questions began that she could never answer without shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She stuffed the ruined gown into the deepest corner of her wardrobe behind winter cloaks that would not be touched for months, but the handkerchief she could not bring herself to destroy. This small square of fine linen that still carried the faint scent of sandalwood and bore the monogrammed initials F.S., that meant nothing to her, yet somehow meant everything, and she tucked it into her drawer beneath her plainest chemises where no one would ever think to look, a secret talisman from a stranger who had promised her that none of it was her fault. The face in her mirror shocked her with its pallor and the bruise blooming along her cheekbone that she would have to explain away as a stumble in the dark, and she pressed powder over the discoloration with hands that shook so violently she scattered the fine dust across her dressing table, then pulled on a long-sleeved morning dress that would hide the finger-shaped bruises encircling, her wrists like shackles she would wear invisibly for weeks to come. When she finally descended to breakfast, Clara was already chattering breathlessly about the masquerade and the 4 gentlemen who had requested her hand for dances and the way Lord Thornhill had looked at her across the supper-room, and Eleanor sat in her usual chair and stared at her untouched toast while the words washed over her like water over stone, meaningless and distant, belonging to a world she had inhabited just yesterday, but could never return to again. Her mother glanced at Eleanor with the familiar mixture of disappointment and resignation that had characterized their interactions for years, and remarked that it was a pity Eleanor had developed a headache so early in the evening, that she had noticed Eleanor slip away before supper, and had hoped she might have made some impression on someone, anyone, but clearly the investment in her new gown had been wasted once again. Eleanor murmured an apology she did not mean for an offense she had not committed, and she thought of the stranger in the black domino mask kneeling before her in the moonlight, his deep voice cutting through her panic, and she knew with terrible certainty that she would spend the rest of her life keeping this secret, burying it so deep that no one would ever know the girl she had been had died in that garden. And across London in his study at Sinclair House, Frederick was already writing letters and making inquiries, searching for the girl in the silver mask whose name he had not quite heard, determined to find her again, though he could not have explained why she haunted him so completely. The seasons turned with indifferent regularity, as Eleanor Ashworth became a ghost haunting the edges of her own life, watching from the periphery as the world continued without her, as invitations arrived addressed primarily to Clara and her mother, while Eleanor's name appeared almost as an afterthought. A courtesy extended to the quiet sister who made up numbers at dinner tables and sat with the chaperones at balls she once dreamed of conquering, and the first winter after the masquerade passed in a blur of grey skies and greyer silences as she perfected the art of invisibility, of being present without being seen, of smiling without feeling, of answering questions about her health and her spirits with practiced phrases that revealed nothing of the wasteland within. By the spring of 1810, Clara had received her first proposal, and by the autumn of that same year she had accepted another from Viscount Thornhill, a match that sent Lady Harriet Ashworth into raptures of satisfaction while Eleanor helped address wedding invitations with steady hands and an unsteady heart. And she stood in the church on that bright December morning, watching her younger sister walk toward a future that Eleanor had quietly surrendered all hope of claiming for herself, the handkerchief with the monogrammed initials FS tucked into her bodice like a secret talisman against complete despair. The years accumulated like dust on forgotten furniture as Eleanor settled into her role as the spinster aunt who arrived at Clara's townhouse to help with the children, first little Thomas in 1811 and then baby Sophia in 1813, and she found a kind of peace in their innocent affection, in the way they reached for her without judgment, without awareness that the woman who read them stories and kissed their fevered foreheads was considered by society to be faded and finished at an age when other women were just beginning their families. She saw Crawford occasionally at events she could not avoid. Viscount Crawford now after his father's death, more powerful and more arrogant than ever, with a pretty wife on his arm who never seemed to notice the coldness in her husband's eyes, and each sighting sent Eleanor retreating to her room with trembling hands and the handkerchief pressed to her lips, breathing in the faded ghost of sandalwood that lingered in the fibers after all these years. Frederick Sinclair had vanished from society entirely. She learned through fragments of gossip, departed for his estates in the north after his father, the Earl of Ravenscroft, died suddenly in the winter of 1809, and then travelled abroad to manage properties and investments far from England, and Eleanor sometimes wondered if the stranger who saved her had been him, this mysterious earl she had never met. But she dismissed the thought as foolish fancy, because why would such a man remember a nameless girl from a masquerade 5 years past? Then, in April of 1814, the news rippled through London, drawing rooms like a stone cast into still water. The Earl of Ravenscroft had returned to England, wealthy beyond imagination, and unmarried still at 32, and every matchmaking mum in the city began planning her campaign, while Eleanor sat in her corner and felt nothing at all, or so she told herself, until the afternoon Lady Montague announced her spring garden party, and Eleanor's mother insisted the entire family must attend. Lady Montague's spring garden party unfolded beneath a canopy of pale pink blossoms that drifted like snow across the manicured lawns, and Eleanor stood at the edge of the gathering in her serviceable grey muslin dress that seemed designed to render her invisible among the bright silks and delicate pastels of the younger women who clustered near the refreshment tables, laughing and fluttering their fans in performances of gaiety that Eleanor had long ago ceased to envy. And she told herself she was content to occupy this familiar position in the shadows, watching Clara's children toddle across the grass under their nursemaid's watchful eye while the conversation around her swirled with excited whispers about the Earl of Ravenscroft, who had finally returned to England after 5 years abroad and was expected to make an appearance this very afternoon. She heard his name repeated like an incantation among the matchmaking mammas and their eager daughters, this wealthy, unmarried earl who had reportedly grown even more handsome during his travels, and Eleanor felt nothing at the speculation, or so she assured herself, because such grand figures moved in spheres far removed from spinster aunts who spent their days reading stories to small children, and their nights clutching faded handkerchiefs that still carried the ghost of sandalwood if she pressed them close enough to her face. The commotion near the garden entrance drew every eye as a tall figure in impeccably tailored dark blue coat entered Lady Montague's domain, and Eleanor glanced up with mild curiosity to observe the celebrated Earl before returning her attention to little Thomas, who was attempting to catch butterflies with his chubby fists. But something made her look again, something in the way he moved through the crowd with purposeful grace, scanning the assembled guests with an intensity that seemed at odds with mere social obligation. Frederick Sinclair, Earl of Ravenscroft, had the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Dark hair touched with early silver at the temples, strong features arranged in an expression of reserved assessment, and eyes that moved across the garden with searching determination until they found Eleanor standing alone by the rose arbor and stopped with an almost physical jolt of recognition that she felt like a touch across the distance between them. He was walking toward her before she could make sense of what was happening, cutting through the crowd of eager debutantes and their disappointed mothers with single-minded focus. And when he stood before her and bowed with formal precision, she caught a scent that stirred something buried so deep she had nearly forgotten it existed. Sandalwood, and something uniquely masculine that made her breath catch in her throat. His voice when he spoke was deep and resonant, asking Lady Montague for an introduction to Miss Ashworth with a tone that brooked no refusal, and Eleanor felt the weight of 100 curious stares as the hostess stammered through the formalities with barely concealed astonishment. And when Frederick took Eleanor's gloved hand and raised it to his lips, his dark eyes held hers with an expression she could not decipher, something like relief and longing and fierce determination all tangled together, and she thought wildly that she must be imagining the way his fingers tightened briefly around hers, as though he had been searching for her across years and continents and had finally found what he sought. The whispers began before Eleanor had even descended the steps of Lady Montague's garden party that fateful afternoon, spreading through London's drawing rooms like wildfire fed by the dry kindling of boredom and malice, and by the following evening, when the Ashworths attended Lady Pemberton's musicale, Eleanor could feel the weight of 100 curious stares pressing against her skin as she entered the crowded salon, heard the rustle of fans and the hiss of speculation that followed her progress across the room like a shadow she could not escape. The Earl of Ravenscroft had called upon the Ashworth residence the very next morning after their introduction, and the morning after that, and every morning for a week until Lady Harriet Ashworth began receiving her eldest daughter's suitor in the best parlour with refreshments served on the family's finest china, a courtesy Eleanor had never before warranted in all her 26 years, and her mother's sudden warmth toward her felt as disorienting as Frederick's attention itself, this impossible transformation from invisible spinster to object of an earl's inexplicable fascination. She overheard Lady Montague at the Havisham ball, declaring to a cluster of eager listeners that the Earl must be touched in the head after all those years abroad, perhaps affected by some tropical fever that had disordered his senses, because what other explanation could there possibly be for his pursuit of Eleanor Ashworth when every diamond of the season stood ready to accept his addresses, and the laughter that followed this pronouncement cut through Eleanor like shards of glass even as she pretended not to hear from her position behind a potted palm, where she had retreated to escape the very scrutiny Lady Montague was now amplifying. Frederick appeared at her elbow moments later, as though summoned by her distress, his presence solid and warm beside her, and he offered his arm with quiet authority, leading her toward the dance floor, where he held her closer than propriety strictly allowed, while murmuring observations about the absurdity of society matrons who had nothing better to do than speculate about matters that were none of their concern. And Eleanor found herself almost smiling despite the ache in her chest, despite the certainty that this attention could not possibly last, that he would eventually discover whatever flaw in her character had kept every other suitor at bay and withdraw like all the rest. Clara arrived at the Ashworth townhouse 3 days later with pink spots of indignation on her lovely cheeks, demanding to know how Eleanor had managed to capture the attention of the most eligible bachelor in England when Clara herself had failed to secure more than a dance at her own coming out. And the jealousy in her younger sister's voice reminded Eleanor painfully that she did not deserve this fortune, that somewhere Crawford was watching and waiting for the perfect moment to destroy whatever fragile happiness she had accidentally stumbled into, and she caught sight of him at the opera that very evening, his cold eyes following Frederick's every gesture of devotion with an expression that made Eleanor's blood turn to ice in her veins, because she knew with terrible certainty that he would never allow her this chance at redemption. The Westbrook ball blazed with 1,000 candles that cast dancing shadows across gilded mirrors and silk wallpaper, and Eleanor slipped away from the crowded ballroom where she could feel the weight of curious stares pressing against her skin like physical touches, each whispered comment and sidelong glance, another reminder that she did not belong in this glittering world that had suddenly taken notice of her only because an earl had inexplicably chosen to pay her attention, and she found refuge in Lord Westbrook's library, where the air smelled of leather bindings and old paper and blessed solitude, sinking into a green leather chair by the dying fire with a sigh of relief that caught in her throat when she heard the door open and close behind her with quiet deliberation. Frederick stood in the doorway with candlelight from the hallway casting his tall figure in silhouette, and he asked in that deep voice that stirred something unnamed in her memory whether he might join her or if she preferred her solitude. And Eleanor found herself gesturing to the chair opposite hers before she could construct the polite refusal that would have been wiser, watching as he settled into the worn leather with an ease that suggested he too found comfort in rooms lined with books rather than filled with dancing strangers. He asked what she was reading, and she confessed she had not yet selected anything, had simply needed to escape, and he nodded as though he understood perfectly before rising to examine the shelves with the focused attention of a true bibliophile, returning with a worn volume that he pressed into her hands with something almost like reverence, and she read the spine to discover it was a collection of essays on natural philosophy that she had sought for months without success. They talked then, as Eleanor had not talked with anyone in years, about books and ideas and the particular pleasure of discovering a kindred mind in unexpected places, and Frederick listened to her opinions with genuine interest rather than the polite tolerance she had learned to expect from men who believed women's thoughts to be decorative at best. And when she ventured a controversial opinion about the limitations of Fordyce's sermons on female education, he laughed with delighted surprise and declared that she was absolutely right, and that Fordyce was a pompous bore who understood nothing of women's actual capacities. She heard herself laughing in response, a sound so unfamiliar that it startled her into silence, and Frederick leaned forward in his chair with an expression of tender intensity that made her heart stutter in her chest as he asked quietly what she hoped for, what dreams she harbored beneath that careful composure. And Eleanor found words spilling from her lips that she had never spoken aloud, confessing her love of learning, her longing to be seen as something more than a disappointment, her secret belief that she had something valuable to offer if only someone would look closely enough to perceive it. The distant strains of a waltz drifted through the closed door as Frederick held her gaze with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense she had constructed, and he said softly that he had been looking, that he had found exactly what he sought. And Eleanor felt the first fragile tendrils of hope begin to unfurl in the barren garden of her heart. The Pembroke residence glowed with afternoon light streaming through tall windows as guests arranged themselves on gilt chairs for the musicale, and Eleanor settled into a seat near the back, where she might observe without being observed, her heart still carrying the warm echo of her conversation with Frederick in the Westbrook Library 1 week prior, that impossible evening when she had laughed and spoken freely and allowed herself to believe for one shimmering moment that happiness might not be entirely beyond her reach, but the warmth fled her body in an instant when she felt someone settle into the empty chair beside her and turned to find Lord Marcus Crawford regarding her with those pale eyes that had haunted her nightmares for 5 years, his smile pleasant and social and utterly terrifying, as he murmured that she was looking well and that he had noticed the Earl of Ravenscroft's marked attentions with great interest, and Eleanor's fingers gripped the edges of her programme so tightly that the paper crumpled as nausea rolled through her stomach, and her vision narrowed to the cruel curve of his lips. He leaned closer under the pretense of adjusting his position, his breath warm against her ear as the first strains of the pianoforte filled the room with a melody that seemed to Eleanor discordant and wrong, and he whispered that he wondered if the Earl knew what sort of woman he was pursuing, whether Frederick Sinclair understood that his chosen bride had already been thoroughly compromised in Lord Harcourt's garden by a man who remembered every detail of that warm September evening with perfect clarity, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as her carefully constructed defenses crumbled under the weight of his words, the reminder that she was not the woman Frederick believed her to be, that she carried a stain that could never be washed clean. Crawford continued in that same pleasant undertone that would appear to any observer as mere social conversation, noting that it would be such a shame if rumours were to circulate about Miss Ashworth's youthful indiscretions, that society could be so unforgiving of women who allowed themselves to be led astray, and surely Eleanor would not want to subject the Earl to the scandal of being associated with damaged goods, would not want to see his noble name dragged through the mud of gossip simply because she had been foolish enough to imagine she deserved a second chance at respectability. The music swelled around them as Eleanor sat frozen in her chair, unable to speak or move or breathe, and Crawford patted her hand with false sympathy, before rising to find another seat closer to the front, leaving her alone with the ruins of her fragile hope scattered like ash around her feet, and she understood with terrible clarity that he would never allow her to escape the shadow of that night, that he would destroy her and Frederick both, rather than risk the exposure that their marriage might bring. And by the time the final notes of the performance faded into polite applause, Eleanor had already decided that she must end this courtship before Crawford carried out his threats, that she must push Frederick away to protect him from the poison that had seeped into her life the moment she followed a golden-masked stranger into a moonlit garden. The days that followed the musicale blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights and desperate avoidance as Eleanor retreated from society with the determination of a wounded animal seeking shelter, refusing Frederick's calls with excuses of headaches and fatigue, watching from her bedroom window as his carriage departed again and again from the Ashworth residence without achieving its purpose. Each visit another knife of guilt twisting in her chest, because she could see even from this distance the rigid set of his shoulders that spoke of confusion and hurt, and she told herself that this pain she caused him now was nothing compared to the devastation that would follow if Crawford made good on his threats, if Frederick's noble name became entangled with the sordid gossip of her ruination, if she destroyed him simply because she had been foolish enough to reach for happiness she did not deserve. Her mother's disappointment manifested in sharp sighs and pointed comments about ungrateful daughters who sabotaged their own prospects, and Clara visited to express incredulous frustration that Eleanor would turn away an Earl when she had no other options and was unlikely ever to receive such attention again. But neither of them understood. Neither of them could see the shadow that followed Eleanor everywhere she went, and so she endured their recriminations in silence, while her heart withered a little more with each passing hour. The letters began arriving on the third day, Frederick's bold handwriting spelling her name across cream-coloured paper sealed with the Ravenscroft crest, and Eleanor gathered them without opening them, adding each one to a growing pile in her desk drawer beside the faded handkerchief she had kept for 5 years, unable to read words that might weaken her resolve, yet equally unable to destroy them, these tangible proofs that someone had wanted her even if that wanting was built on a foundation of ignorance about her true nature. It was Aunt Agnes who finally broke through Eleanor's careful isolation, arriving unannounced on the 8th day with her keen eyes and gentle manner, settling into the chair beside Eleanor's bed where she had taken to spending her afternoons in feigned illness. And her aunt said nothing at first, simply took Eleanor's cold hand in her warm one and waited with the patience of someone who understood that some truths could not be rushed. When Eleanor finally broke, the confession emerging in fragments between sobs, Aunt Agnes listened without judgment and then pulled her niece into an embrace that smelled of lavender and safety, murmuring that Eleanor was not ruined, had never been ruined, that what had been done to her was a crime, and not a stain on her character. And though Eleanor could not quite believe these words, she clung to them like a drowning woman grasps at driftwood. Across London in his study, Frederick sat surrounded by inquiries and reports, his investigation into Eleanor's sudden withdrawal leading him inexorably toward a name that made his blood run cold with recognition and rage: Lord Marcus Crawford, the same man he had seen leading a silver-masked girl into darkness 5 years ago. And as the pieces fell into place with terrible clarity, Frederick understood at last why Eleanor was running, and he vowed that Crawford would never threaten her again. The study at Sinclair House lay shrouded in the amber glow of oil lamps as evening settled over London, on May 22, 1814, and Frederick stood before the massive oak desk where documents and correspondence spread like the evidence of a criminal trial, his hands braced against the polished wood as he stared at the damning picture that had emerged from 2 weeks of relentless investigation. And beside him, Sir Thomas Pembroke sat in leather armchair with a glass of untouched brandy, watching his friend with the concerned expression of a man who recognized barely contained fury when he witnessed it. The guest lists from Lord Harcourt's masquerade 5 years prior had been difficult to obtain, but not impossible for a man of Frederick's resources, and cross-referenced with servant testimonies purchased through generous compensation, a pattern had emerged that made Frederick's blood turn to ice in his veins. Multiple young women who had found themselves alone with Lord Marcus Crawford at various events over the years, some who had left society abruptly afterward, others who had married in suspicious haste to men of lesser standing, all of them bearing the invisible marks of a predator who selected his victims with calculated precision. Frederick picked up the letter from a former Harcourt footman now employed in the country, the man's account of seeing a gentleman in a gold mask leading a young woman in pale blue toward the garden, of hearing sounds that had troubled him but that he had dismissed as none of his concern. And Frederick's grip tightened on the paper until it crumpled in his fist as he thought of Eleanor alone in that darkness with a monster while he searched frantically through hedgerows and pathways, arriving moments too late to prevent what Crawford had begun. Thomas spoke quietly into the heavy silence, noting that the evidence was compelling, but that Crawford was powerful now, a viscount with connections and wealth, and that moving against him openly would require careful strategy. But Frederick turned to his friend with eyes that held something cold and implacable, and he replied that Crawford would not see him coming, that men like Crawford relied on their victims' shame and silence to protect them, never imagining that someone might gather the scattered threads of their cruelty and weave them into a noose. The rage that burned in Frederick's chest was not the hot, impulsive anger of youth, but something far more dangerous. The patient, calculated fury of a man who had spent 5 years searching for a silver-masked girl, only to discover that the shadow haunting her eyes was cast by a villain who still walked freely through ballrooms and drawing-rooms. And as Frederick gathered the documents into a leather portfolio, he made 2 vows to himself in the quiet of that lamplit study. First, that Crawford would never again threaten Eleanor or any other woman, and second, that he would prove to the woman he loved that her past held no power to diminish her worth in his eyes, that he had known pieces of her truth since the night he held her trembling in a moonlit garden, and that his heart remained unchanged, perhaps even strengthened, by the full understanding of what she had survived and the courage it had required simply to continue living beneath the weight of undeserved shame. The morning of May 25, 1814, broke grey and cold over the edge of London, where the city gave way to open fields and isolated structures, and Frederick Sinclair stood waiting beside an abandoned mill as the first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon, his breath misting in the chill air, while his eyes remained fixed on the road where a lone carriage would soon appear, carrying the man he had summoned, with a carefully worded note that promised either ruination or resolution. Crawford arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his expression shifting from arrogant confidence to wary suspicion as he stepped down from his carriage and found himself alone with the Earl of Ravenscroft in this desolate place. No seconds present, no witnesses to whatever transaction was about to unfold, and Frederick watched the other man approach with the detached assessment of a predator who has already calculated every possible outcome and found them all favorable to his purpose. The Viscount opened with bluster, demanding to know the meaning of this irregular summons, suggesting that if Frederick wished to discuss some business matter, there were civilized ways to arrange such meetings. But his voice carried an undercurrent of nervousness that Frederick found deeply satisfying as he reached into his coat and withdrew the leather portfolio containing documents that represented months of careful investigation into Crawford's history of predation. Frederick spoke quietly as he detailed what he knew, his tone conversational and almost pleasant as he described the pattern of young women who had encountered Crawford at various social events over the past decade, the servant testimonies he had gathered, the letters from families who had been paid to keep silent, the physician's reports that documented injuries consistent with violence, and with each revelation, Crawford's face grew paler until the arrogant mask crumbled entirely to reveal the frightened creature beneath. The Viscount attempted threats of his own, suggesting that any accusations would damage the reputation of certain ladies more than himself, but Frederick smiled coldly and replied that he had taken great care to protect the identities of Crawford's victims in his documentation while ensuring that Crawford himself would be utterly destroyed should these materials reach certain influential hands, including the Lord Chancellor and several newspaper editors, who owed Frederick considerable favors. The negotiation that followed was brief and brutal in its efficiency, as Frederick laid out his terms with the precision of a man who had considered every angle. Crawford would leave England within the fortnight. He would sign over management of his estates to a trustee of Frederick's choosing. He would never return to English society, and in exchange Frederick would keep the evidence sealed rather than pursuing criminal proceedings that would see Crawford hanged or transported. Crawford accepted because he had no choice, his hands trembling as he signed the documents Frederick produced, his eyes holding a hatred that Frederick absorbed without concern, because hatred from such a man was meaningless compared to the knowledge that Eleanor would never again feel those cold eyes following her across a ballroom. As the carriage carried Crawford away toward Dover and eventual exile, Frederick stood in the strengthening dawn light and felt something loosen in his chest. Not satisfaction precisely, but the grim relief of a duty fulfilled. And his thoughts turned already toward Mayfair, where a woman with haunted eyes waited without knowing that the shadow threatening her had finally been banished forever. The afternoon of May 28th, 1814, found Eleanor seated in the small parlor of the Ashworth family home, her embroidery lying untouched in her lap as she stared through the window at the garden where spring flowers bloomed with an optimism she could not share. And when the butler announced that the Earl of Ravenscroft had called and was requesting a private audience, her heart seized with a painful mixture of longing and dread, because she had spent the past weeks convincing herself that her withdrawal had been the kindest gift she could offer him, freedom from association with a woman whose past would only bring him shame. Her mother's sharp intake of breath and sudden flurry of activity suggested that Lady Harriet saw opportunity where Eleanor saw only the necessity of a final farewell, and before Eleanor could protest, she found herself ushered into the drawing-room where Frederick stood by the fireplace, his tall figure casting long shadows in the afternoon light, his expression holding something she could not quite decipher, as his grey eyes found hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite her determination to remain composed. He looked different somehow, Eleanor thought, as she forced herself to curtsy with appropriate formality, as though some weight had been lifted from his shoulders even as a new gravity settled in its place, and when he asked if they might speak privately, her mother practically fled the room with unseemly haste, leaving them alone with only the ticking of the mantel clock to mark the silence that stretched between them. Eleanor spoke first because she could not bear the anticipation, her voice steady, despite the trembling of her hands, as she told him that she understood why he had come, and that she wished to spare them both the awkwardness of prolonged explanation, that she was grateful for his attentions these past weeks, but that she had come to realize they would not suit, and she delivered these lies with the calm dignity of a woman who had long practice in hiding her true feelings behind a mask of serene acceptance. Frederick listened without interruption, his expression unchanged as she spoke the words she had rehearsed during sleepless nights, and when she finished, he simply asked if she had truly convinced herself of that, or if she was merely trying to convince him, and the gentleness in his voice nearly undid all her careful composure because she had expected anger or perhaps relief, but not this patient tenderness that seemed to see straight through her defenses. He crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could smell sandalwood, and something else that triggered a memory she could not quite grasp. And he told her that he had not come to say goodbye, that he had in fact come to say something quite different, that he knew she had been avoiding him, and he believed he understood why, and though he would not press her to explain what she was not ready to share, he wanted her to know that nothing she could tell him would change what he felt, that he had seen her strength and her kindness and her quiet courage, and that if she would permit him to prove himself worthy of her trust, he would spend whatever time necessary demonstrating that his regard was not the fleeting interest of a bored nobleman, but something far deeper and more enduring than she seemed capable of believing she deserved. Eleanor felt the tears she had forbidden herself to shed, rising unbidden as his words washed over her, and she turned away because she could not bear to see sincerity in his grey eyes when she knew that sincerity would transform to disgust once he understood what she was, and her voice emerged small and broken as she told him that he did not know her, that he had constructed some image of her in his mind that bore no resemblance to the reality, that she was not the woman he believed her to be, and that if he knew the truth, he would not stand before her, speaking of regard and worthiness, but would instead flee this house and thank Providence for his narrow escape from entanglement with someone so thoroughly ruined. Frederick did not retreat at her words, but instead moved closer, and when he spoke his voice held a certainty that seemed to reach through all her carefully constructed defense as he told her that he knew more than she imagined, that he had seen her courage when she did not know she was being observed, that he had watched her move through a society that dismissed her with a dignity that most could never achieve, and that whatever secrets she believed disqualified her from happiness were not the sum of her worth, but merely chapters in a story that was far from finished. She turned back to face him then, her composure finally cracking as she asked why he persisted, why he would not simply accept her rejection and find some suitable young woman without complications or shadows, some fresh-faced debutante who could give him the uncomplicated future an earl deserved. And her voice broke on the question because part of her desperately wanted him to answer, to provide some reason she could believe, some foundation upon which she might dare to build the hope she had denied herself for 5 long years. His answer came not in words, but in the way he reached for her hand and held it gently between both of his own, his touch warm and steady, as he told her that he had travelled across continents and through years searching for something he could not name until he found it again in a London garden party, that the woman before him possessed a quality he had recognized instantly and had never forgotten, that he was not interested in uncomplicated or suitable, but only in her, Eleanor Ashworth, with all her shadows and secrets and the quiet strength that had carried her through suffering, he suspected was far greater than she had ever revealed. The drawing-room seemed to shrink around them as Eleanor searched his face for deception and found only patience and something that looked terrifyingly like love. And when Aunt Agnes appeared in the doorway with tea she did not require, Eleanor understood that her aunt had been watching and hoping, and perhaps scheming in her gentle way, and as Frederick released her hand with obvious reluctance and promised to call again tomorrow and every day until she believed him, Eleanor felt the first fragile tendril of hope unfurl in the barren garden of her heart, where she had thought nothing would ever grow again. The days that followed Frederick's declaration unfolded like the slow opening of a flower long denied sunlight, each visit bringing Eleanor closer to believing what her heart yearned to accept, even as her mind continued to whisper warnings of inevitable disappointment. And true to his word, he appeared at the Ashworth residence every afternoon without fail, sometimes bearing small gifts of books he thought she might enjoy, or flowers from his hothouse that he presented with a solemnity that made her want to laugh and weep simultaneously, because no one had ever treated her preferences as worthy of such careful consideration. They walked together in the modest Ashworth garden, while her mother watched from the window with barely concealed astonishment. And during these walks, Frederick spoke of his years abroad with a candour that surprised her, describing the loneliness of foreign capitals and the way grief had driven him to constant motion after his father's death. And Eleanor found herself sharing pieces of her own isolation in return, carefully edited stories of watching her sister marry and her own gradual acceptance of spinsterhood, though she never approached the central wound that still festered beneath her composed exterior. Aunt Agnes became their unlikely champion, arranging for them to take tea in the smaller parlour where they might converse without Lady Harriet's hovering presence, and during these quieter moments Eleanor discovered that Frederick possessed a dry wit that emerged only in comfortable company, and that his grey eyes warmed to something almost silver when he laughed at her observations about the absurdities of society. She learned that he read philosophy in the original Greek and preferred dogs to horses, and had once gotten thoroughly lost in Venice because he refused to ask directions. And these small revelations accumulated like treasures she hoarded against the day when surely this dream would end and she would need memories to sustain her through the long years ahead. What she could not understand was why he had chosen her when London overflowed with younger and prettier and unmarked women who would have accepted his suit with uncomplicated joy. And when she finally voiced this question during a walk through the garden on a warm June afternoon, Frederick stopped beneath the old apple tree and regarded her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache as he told her that he had spent years searching for something he had glimpsed only once, a quality of spirit that transcended beauty or youth or any of the shallow measures by which society judged worth, and that he had found it again in her and would not be persuaded that he was mistaken. Eleanor wanted to believe him with a desperation that frightened her, and as the weeks passed and his constancy never wavered, she began to allow herself small moments of hope, though always shadowed by the knowledge that her secret still lay between them like a buried blade waiting to cut them both, and she knew that before she could accept the happiness he offered, she would have to find the courage to tell him the truth and watch his regard transform to the disgust she had always known she deserved. The proposal came on a golden afternoon in late June, when the roses in the Ashworth garden had reached their full bloom, and the air hung heavy with their perfume. And Eleanor had begun to allow herself to imagine that perhaps happiness was not entirely beyond her reach when Frederick took her hand beneath the arbour and spoke words she had never dared dream any man would address to her, asking if she would do him the honour of becoming his wife, his countess, his companion, for whatever years Providence might grant them. And for one breathless moment, Eleanor felt joy so pure and overwhelming that it obliterated every shadow that had haunted her for 5 long years. But even as the word yes formed on her lips, the memory of Crawford's sneering face rose before her, and she heard again his whispered threat about secrets and ruin, and she understood with devastating clarity that she could not accept Frederick's offer without first telling him the truth that would surely destroy everything between them, and so instead of the acceptance he clearly expected, she withdrew her hand and watched his expression shift from hope to confusion as she told him that before she could answer, she must tell him something that would almost certainly change his feelings and his offer, something she had never spoken aloud to any living soul. Frederick's grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her want to flee even as it anchored her in place, and he told her quietly that nothing she could say would alter his feelings, that he knew her heart and her character, and those were the foundations upon which he wished to build a life. But Eleanor shook her head because he did not understand, could not understand until she forced the shameful words past her lips, and she drew a shaking breath and began to speak of a masquerade ball 5 years ago, of a girl in a silver mask who believed a charming man's lies, of a garden and darkness and violence that had left her ruined in every way that mattered to the world in which they lived. Her voice trembled and broke as she told him that she was not what a man of his position deserved, that she came to him already damaged by another's hands, that the innocent bride he imagined did not exist, and had not existed since that terrible night when her foolish trust had cost her everything. And as she spoke, she could not bear to look at his face because she knew what she would see there, and she wanted one more moment before the warmth in his eyes transformed to the disgust and disappointment she had always known she deserved. The silence that followed her confession seemed to stretch into eternity, broken only by birdsong and the distant sound of Clara's children playing somewhere in the house. And Eleanor stood with her eyes fixed on the rose petals scattered across the garden path, waiting for the footsteps that would signal his departure, waiting for the cold words of withdrawal that would confirm every terrible thing she had ever believed about herself. And when Frederick finally spoke, his voice was so gentle that she thought she must have misheard him, as he said simply that he already knew, and that her past changed nothing except to deepen his admiration for the strength that had carried her through such darkness alone. Eleanor stared at him as his words penetrated the fortress of shame she had constructed so carefully over 5 long years, and she found herself unable to comprehend what he was saying because it contradicted everything she had believed about herself and about the inevitable consequences of her ruin. And she shook her head slowly because he could not possibly mean what she thought he meant, could not possibly be suggesting that he had known about Crawford and the garden and her defilement before she had spoken of it. And yet his grey eyes held hers with such steady certainty that she felt the ground beneath her feet shift as if the very foundations of her understanding were crumbling. He knew, he said again, his voice gentle but firm as he reached for her trembling hands and held them between his own warm palms. He had known since that night, because he had been there in the garden. He had been the masked stranger who pulled Crawford away from her and held her while she shook, and promised her that none of it was her fault. And as his words sank into her consciousness, Eleanor felt a dizzying rush of recognition, as fragments of memory she had tried so hard to bury came flooding back with sudden clarity. The deep voice that had murmured comfort against her hair, the scent of sandalwood that had somehow made her feel safe amidst the terror, the strong hands that had been so careful not to frighten her further. "The handkerchief," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And Frederick nodded as he told her that he had searched for her for years, that he had never forgotten the brave girl in the silver mask who had fought so fiercely against a monster, and then carried her pain in silence rather than burden anyone else with her suffering, and that when he had finally found her again, he had known immediately that his heart had been right to wait, to search, to hope that somewhere the woman he had glimpsed in that terrible moment still existed. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the impossible truth of his words rearranged everything she had believed about herself and her future, and she understood now why his presence had always felt familiar, why his voice had stirred something deep within her memory, why the scent of sandalwood had made her heart ache with an emotion she could not name. And she realized that the stranger who had saved her and the man who had courted her so patiently were one and the same, that he had known her secret from the very beginning and had chosen her not despite it, but in full knowledge of everything Crawford had done. Frederick lifted one hand to cup her face as he told her that she had never been ruined in his eyes, that Crawford's violence had damaged only Crawford himself, and that if she would consent to be his wife, he would spend every day of their lives proving to her that she deserved every happiness the world had to offer. And Eleanor heard herself say yes through her tears as joy and disbelief and overwhelming gratitude flooded through her in equal measure. The weeks that followed their engagement passed in a blur of preparations and joy that Eleanor could scarcely believe belonged to her own life, and she moved through the days feeling as though she had awakened from a long grey dream into a world suddenly filled with colour and warmth and possibility. And when she caught sight of her reflection in mirrors, she barely recognized the woman who looked back at her with bright eyes and flushed cheeks and an expression that could only be called hopeful. Lady Harriet transformed overnight from a mother who had long since written off her middle daughter into a whirlwind of activity, planning the wedding of the season with an enthusiasm that might have been amusing had Eleanor possessed the energy to feel anything beyond her own overwhelming happiness, and Clara arrived from the country with her children and her barely concealed jealousy, though even her pointed comments about the surprising nature of the match could not penetrate the protective glow that surrounded Eleanor whenever Frederick was near. The banns were read on 3 successive Sundays in both the Ashworth Parish Church and the Grand Chapel at Ravenscroft, and with each reading, Eleanor felt another layer of her old self fall away. The frightened girl who had hidden in shadows and believed herself unworthy of love, gradually replaced by a woman who was learning to stand in sunlight without flinching. Frederick called every day without fail, and their conversations ranged from the practical details of their future household to the dreams and fears they had each carried in silence for so long. And Eleanor found herself telling him things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, not just about the masquerade, but about the years of invisibility that had followed, the slow erosion of hope, the way she had trained herself to want nothing so that she could not be disappointed. He listened to everything with that steady grey gaze that made her feel anchored in the world. And when she finished speaking, he would take her hand and tell her that those years of pain had not been wasted, that they had shaped her into the remarkable woman he loved, and that every moment of suffering she had endured alone was a moment he intended to repay with joy. The wedding gown was commissioned from the finest modiste in London, cream silk with delicate lace at the bodice and sleeves, and when Eleanor stood for her final fitting, she thought of the pale blue gown she had worn to the masquerade 5 years ago, the gown that Crawford had torn, and she understood that she was not the same girl who had worn that dress, that she had survived and grown and somehow found her way to this moment of impossible happiness. Aunt Agnes came to see her the night before the wedding and pressed a small package into her hands, and when Eleanor opened it, she found a delicate gold chain bearing a single pearl, and her aunt told her through tears that every woman deserved to feel cherished on her wedding day, and that she had always known Eleanor was destined for more than the shadows society had assigned her. The wedding morning of October 14th, 1814, dawned grey and misty, as autumn mornings in England so often do, but Eleanor felt as though the sun were blazing through every window of the Ashworth townhouse as she sat before her mirror and watched the maid arrange her hair in an elaborate style befitting a countess, and she thought of all the mornings she had sat in this same chair, believing that her life would never change, that she would grow old in this room, watching seasons pass outside her window, while happiness remained something that happened to other women, women like Clara, who had never known the touch of violence or the weight of secret shame. The cream silk gown whispered against her skin as she dressed, and Aunt Agnes fastened the pearl necklace around her throat with trembling fingers, while Lady Harriet bustled about giving unnecessary instructions to servants who had managed perfectly well without her guidance, and Eleanor caught her aunt's eye in the mirror and saw tears there that matched her own, tears of joy and disbelief and gratitude that this impossible day had finally arrived. The carriage ride to the church passed in a blur of London streets she had walked 1,000 times feeling invisible, and she remembered how she had moved through these same neighborhoods, believing that no one saw her, that she had become a ghost haunting her own life. And now people stopped on the pavements to watch the bridal carriage pass, and she understood that she was becoming visible again, that Frederick's love had somehow called her back from the shadows where she had hidden for so long. The church of St. George's, Hanover Square, rose before her like a promise fulfilled, its grand columns and elegant facade a setting she had never imagined for herself during all those years of quiet resignation. And as her father helped her from the carriage, she felt the weight of the past 5 years lift from her shoulders with each step she took toward the entrance. The sanctuary was filled with faces she recognized from countless social gatherings, where she had stood along the walls pretending not to notice the pitying glances and whispered comments, and she saw Lady Montague in the pews looking thoroughly astonished that the overlooked Ashworth sister had captured the most eligible earl in England, and she felt a small, fierce satisfaction in proving wrong everyone who had ever dismissed her as unworthy of notice. But all of these observations faded to insignificance when she saw Frederick waiting at the altar, his tall figure immaculate in dark blue coat and cream waistcoat, his grey eyes finding hers the moment she appeared at the end of the aisle, and in His gaze she saw everything he had promised her during their courtship, the love and acceptance and unwavering devotion of a man who had searched for her across years and distance and finally brought her home. She walked toward him, feeling each step as a victory over the girl who had stumbled through a dark garden, believing her life was over. And when she placed her hand in his, she knew that she was not the same woman who had hidden in shadows, that she had been transformed by his recognition of her worth, and that together they would build a life more beautiful than anything she had dared to imagine during those long years of invisibility and shame and secret sorrow. The ceremony itself passed in a sacred hush, broken only by the vicar's solemn words and the soft patter of rain against the stained glass windows, and Eleanor spoke her vows in a voice that trembled with emotion but did not falter, each promise a declaration that the girl who had believed herself unworthy of love had finally found the courage to claim the happiness that stood before her in the form of this remarkable man who had searched for her across years and never wavered in his devotion. Frederick's voice was steady and deep as he spoke his own vows, the same voice that had whispered comfort to her in a dark garden 5 years ago, though she did not yet know it. And when he slid the gold band onto her finger, she felt the weight of it as a promise kept, a circle without end that bound her to him and him to her for all the days that remained to them. The wedding breakfast that followed was held at the Ashworth townhouse, and Eleanor moved through the celebration feeling as though she were floating slightly above the ground, accepting congratulations from people who had ignored her for years and whose sudden warmth might have seemed hypocritical had she possessed any room in her heart for bitterness on this day of overwhelming joy. Lady Montague approached her with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes and offered felicitations that Eleanor accepted with the gracious dignity of a woman who no longer needed the approval of those who had dismissed her, and she caught Frederick watching this exchange from across the room with a small, proud smile that told her he understood exactly what this moment meant. Clara kissed her cheek and wished her happiness in a voice that contained only the smallest edge of envy, and Eleanor found that she could forgive her sister for years of thoughtless comments because she understood now that Clara had never known what it meant to be invisible, had never learned the particular pain of being overlooked and the particular triumph of being finally seen. The hours passed in a blur of toasts and well-wishes and stolen glances between bride and groom, and when at last the carriage arrived to take them to Ravenscroft Manor, Eleanor climbed inside feeling as though she were departing not just from her family home, but from her entire former life, leaving behind the woman she had been to become someone new, someone who bore the name of Sinclair and the title of Countess, and the love of a man who had chosen her above all others. The journey to the manor took several hours through countryside painted in autumn colors of amber and gold and deep russet, and Frederick held her hand throughout the drive while rain streamed down the carriage windows, and they spoke quietly of their hopes for the future, the children they might have, the life they would build together in the home that was now hers as well as his. When Ravenscroft Manor finally came into view through the mist, its grand facade illuminated by dozens of windows glowing with warm light against the grey afternoon, Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat at the beauty of it, and Frederick squeezed her hand and told her that he had waited years to bring her home, and she understood that he meant something more than she yet knew, a truth she would discover before this night was over. The household staff of Ravenscroft Manor lined the entrance hall to greet their new mistress, and Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of curious eyes upon her as Frederick led her through the grand doorway into a world that now belonged to her as much as to him. And she wondered if she would ever feel worthy of such magnificence, of the marble floors and soaring ceilings and paintings that seemed to glow with the accumulated history of generations of Sinclairs who had walked these halls before her. Frederick introduced her to the housekeeper, Mrs. Thornton, a dignified woman whose warm smile seemed genuine rather than merely polite, and to the butler, Mr. Davies, whose formal bow contained a hint of something that looked almost like approval, and Eleanor understood that Frederick had chosen his staff with the same discernment he applied to everything in his life, surrounding himself with people of quality and discretion. The tour of the manor took them through drawing rooms and parlours and a magnificent library that made Eleanor catch her breath with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and leather chairs positioned beside tall windows. And Frederick told her that this room was now hers to arrange as she pleased, that he wanted her to feel at home in every corner of his estate, and she thought of all the years she had spent reading in her small bedroom at the Ashworth townhouse, dreaming of a life larger than the one she had been given. The dining room where they took their wedding supper was intimate rather than grand. A small table set before a crackling fire with candles casting soft light over the silver and crystal, and Eleanor found that she could actually eat despite her nervousness, that Frederick's calm presence beside her made everything feel possible, even this new life as Countess of Ravenscroft, that still seemed like something that was happening to someone else, some other Eleanor who had not spent years believing herself unworthy of love. They spoke of small things over dinner, of the manor's grounds and the village nearby, and the improvements Frederick planned for the tenant cottages, and Eleanor listened to him describe his vision for their life together with a growing sense of wonder that this man had chosen her, had pursued her with such determination, had refused to accept her withdrawal when any sensible man would have moved on to easier conquests. The meal ended, and servants cleared the dishes, and the hour grew late as rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, and Eleanor felt her nervousness return as she realized that the moment she had dreaded was approaching, the wedding night when all secrets must be revealed and all illusions shattered, and she knew that she could not give herself to Frederick without first confessing the truth that had haunted her for so long. He led her up the grand staircase to the family wing where their chambers awaited, his hand warm and steady on hers, and she tried to memorize every detail of this moment in case it was the last time he looked at her with such tenderness, in case her confession destroyed everything they had built together, and she prayed for the courage to speak the words that might end her marriage before it had truly begun, trusting that honesty was owed to this man who had given her so much already. The bedchamber that awaited them was warm with firelight and the soft glow of candles placed on every surface, and Eleanor stood in its center feeling as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice from which there could be no return, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain Frederick must hear it as he closed the door behind them with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the silence like a pronouncement of fate. The room was beautiful, she noticed through her haze of terror, decorated in shades of deep blue and cream with a massive four-poster bed draped in velvet curtains that seemed to represent everything she had dreamed of and everything she feared she did not deserve, and she found herself unable to move from her spot near the window where rain continued its steady assault against the glass, as though the heavens themselves were weeping for what she was about to lose. Frederick moved to stand before the fire, his tall figure casting long shadows across the carpet, and he watched her with those dark eyes that had always seemed to see straight through to her soul, and she wondered if he could see the secret that writhed within her like a living thing, the confession that pressed against her lips, demanding release before she could allow him to touch her as a husband touches a wife. She had changed into her white nightgown while he had given her privacy, the delicate fabric doing nothing to warm the chill that had settled into her bones, and her hands trembled as she clasped them before her in a gesture that might have been prayer if she had possessed any faith that prayers could save her now from the consequences of a night 5 years past. Frederick spoke her name softly. Eleanor, just her name, and nothing more, but the tenderness in his voice nearly undid her completely, because she knew that tenderness would vanish the moment she revealed the truth about the woman he had married, the damaged and ruined creature who had stood before a vicar that very morning and promised herself to him without first confessing that she came to him already broken. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat like thorns, and she had to close her eyes against the tears that threatened because she had promised herself she would not cry, that she would face this moment with whatever dignity remained to her after everything else had been stripped away. And when she finally spoke, her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper, that seemed to hang in the candlelit air between them. "I must tell you something," she said, and the words felt like stones being pulled from her chest, one by one. "Something that may change everything between us. Something I should have told you before we spoke our vows, but I was too much a coward, too desperate to hold on to the dream of happiness for just a few hours more before it was taken from me as I always knew it would be." Frederick moved toward her, but stopped when she held up one trembling hand, and she saw something in his expression that she could not quite identify, something that looked almost like recognition or perhaps anticipation, and she forced herself to continue speaking before her courage failed her entirely. "I am not what you think I am," she whispered, and the confession that had haunted her for 5 long years finally began to spill forth into the space between them, where it would either destroy everything or somehow set her free. The words poured from Eleanor like water breaking through a dam that had held for 5 long years, and she told him everything, her voice trembling but determined, as she confessed that she was not the innocent bride he believed he had married, that something had happened to her at a masquerade ball when she was 21 years old, that a man had taken her into the garden and had violated her in ways she could barely bring herself to describe, and she watched Frederick's face as she spoke, expecting to see the disgust and horror that she had always known would greet this revelation. But instead, she saw something else entirely, something that looked almost like grief mingled with a tenderness so profound it made her chest ache with confusion. She told him about the champagne and the charming words and her own foolish naivety that had led her into the darkness where a monster waited, and she told him about the terror and the pain and the shame that had followed her every day since, wrapping itself around her soul like chains she had believed would bind her forever. And she told him that she understood if he wanted to annul the marriage, that she would not fight him, that she had always known she did not deserve the happiness he had offered her. The rain continued its steady assault against the windows as Eleanor finished her confession, and the silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity while she waited for the pronouncement of her doom, her eyes fixed on the carpet because she could not bear to see the moment when his love transformed into revulsion, and she thought that at least she had been honest. At least she had not deceived him completely, even if that honesty would cost her everything. She had dared to dream might be hers. But then Frederick moved, crossing the space between them with 3 deliberate steps until he stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and he reached out to cup her face in his hands with a gentleness that made no sense in the context of what she had just revealed, tilting her chin upward until she had no choice but to meet his eyes, which were bright with unshed tears that confused her utterly, because why would he weep for a ruined woman who had just confessed her unworthiness? "I know," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion as he spoke the 2 words that shattered everything. Eleanor thought she understood about her husband and her past and the secret that had haunted her for half a decade. "I know what happened to you that night, Eleanor, and I know because I was there, because I have carried the memory of you in that garden just as you have carried it, because I was the man in the black domino mask who pulled him off you and held you while you trembled and gave you my handkerchief and promised you that none of it was your fault, and I have searched for you ever since, my darling. I have loved you since that terrible, beautiful night when I found you and lost you all in the same hour." Eleanor stared at him as the words he had spoken echoed through the candle-lit chamber, and for a long moment she could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything but search his face for some sign that she had misheard or misunderstood, because what he was saying was impossible. It was a fantasy, conjured by her desperate heart. It could not be real. And yet his eyes held hers with an intensity that permitted no doubt, and she felt the ground beneath her feet shift, as everything she had believed about her life began to rearrange itself into a new and terrifying pattern. "You were there," she whispered, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant and hollow as though it belonged to someone else entirely, and Frederick nodded slowly, his hand still cradling her face with a tenderness that made her want to weep, and scream and laugh all at once, because the man who had saved her, the mysterious stranger whose kindness had been the only light in 5 years of darkness, had been standing before her all along, wearing the face of the man she had married. "The handkerchief," she breathed, and understanding crashed over her like a wave as she remembered the monogrammed linen she had kept hidden in her drawer for half a decade, the initials FS that she had traced with her fingertips on countless sleepless nights, and she had never connected those letters to Frederick Sinclair because she had never allowed herself to believe that the man who had held her in the garden could be real, could be someone she might actually find, could be anyone other than a ghost who haunted her memories with whispered promises that none of it was her fault. "I searched for you," Frederick said, and his voice broke on the words as the composure he had maintained throughout her confession finally cracked to reveal the depth of emotion beneath. "I searched for years. Eleanor, I made inquiries at every ball and every gathering. I described your silver mask and your pale blue gown to anyone who might have known, but you had vanished from society, and no one seemed to know or care about the quiet Middle Ashworth daughter. And then my father died, and I had to go abroad to manage the estates, and I thought I had lost you forever until I returned this spring and saw you standing in Lady Montague's garden, looking so sad and so beautiful, and so utterly unaware that you had haunted my dreams for 5 long years." Eleanor's knees gave way beneath her, and Frederick caught her, lowering them both to the carpet before the fire, where they knelt facing each other like supplicants before an altar of truth finally revealed. And she reached up to touch his face with trembling fingers, tracing the strong line of his jaw and the curve of his cheekbone as though she were blind and learning him for the first time. Which in a way she was, because everything she thought she knew about this man had just been transformed into something infinitely more precious and more terrifying than she had ever imagined possible. "You were there," Eleanor repeated, and the words seemed to unlock something within her chest that had been frozen solid for 5 years, a great thawing that sent tremors through her entire body as the implications of what Frederick had revealed cascaded through her understanding like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, because the stranger who had haunted her dreams, the man whose kindness had been the single thread of hope she had clung to through endless nights of shame and despair, was not a phantom or a figment of her desperate imagination, but was instead the man who knelt before her now, with tears tracking silently down his face and love blazing in his eyes with an intensity that threatened to consume them both. "You searched for me," she said, and her voice cracked on the words because she could not comprehend a world in which anyone would search for her, would remember her, would carry her in their heart across oceans and years and the vast, indifferent machinery of society that had declared her worthless and forgotten. And yet here was Frederick Sinclair, the Earl of Ravenscroft, telling her that she had haunted him just as surely as he had haunted her, that they had been bound together since that terrible night by invisible threads neither of them had recognized until this moment of revelation. "I never stopped," Frederick said, and his voice was hoarse with emotion as he covered her hands with his own, warming fingers that had gone cold with shock. "I never stopped searching, and I never stopped hoping. And when I returned to England and saw you standing in that garden looking so lost and so lovely, I thought my heart would stop because there you were at last, the girl in the silver mask, the woman I had dreamed of finding for 5 long years. And you were more beautiful than I remembered and sadder than I could bear, and I knew that I would spend the rest of my life trying to make you smile if you would only let me." Eleanor shook her head slowly, as though trying to clear it of cobwebs that had accumulated over half a decade, and she thought of all the times she had wondered about her mysterious saviour, all the nights she had pressed his handkerchief to her cheek, and imagined what might have happened if she had looked more closely at his face, or asked his name, or been brave enough to seek him out in the aftermath of her trauma. And now she realized that fate or providence or whatever force governed the universe had been working all along to bring them back together, weaving their separate threads into a single tapestry whose pattern she was only now beginning to perceive. "You knew," she breathed, the understanding dawning with terrible clarity. You knew this whole time we were courting. You knew what happened to me, and you pursued me anyway. You asked me to marry you, knowing that I was ruined, knowing that I was damaged, knowing everything that I believed would make me unworthy of love. And Frederick nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, as he witnessed the transformation taking place within her. The shattering of chains she had worn so long, she had forgotten they were not part of her own skin. "I knew," he confirmed quietly. "And I loved you, not despite what happened, but because of who you became afterward, because of your courage and your dignity and your refusal to let that monster destroy your spirit completely."